April 1945. A military transport truck bounces across the flat expanse of Iowa farmland. Through gaps between wooden slats, a young German prisoner named Greta peers out at the landscape rolling past. Green fields stretch endlessly. No bomb craters pockmarking the earth. No bodies scattered across the land. Nothing matches the propaganda reels she'd memorized back home, films that promised her America was a burning wasteland. Just 3 weeks ago, she'd resigned herself to execution. Instead, she'd received lukewarm soup, a scratchy blanket that smelled of lye soap, and something that seemed impossible, her name carefully written on an official form. Not a number. A name, Greta Hoffmann. 24 years old, Luftwaffe Communications Auxiliary. The truck's brakes hiss as it pulls through a gate. Women are ordered out quickly, and Greta braces herself. Torture cells, starvation, everything the training films had warned her about. But then the breeze shifts direction, and an unexpected smell cuts through her fear. Cinnamon, butter, the sweet warmth of baked apples. Several women freeze mid-step, confusion written across their faces. One whispers in German, her voice trembling, "Apfelkuchen, apple cake." The scent drifts from what appears to be the mess hall, where an American sergeant in uniform stands beside an industrial oven, carefully setting down fresh pies. Their golden crusts steam in the afternoon heat. How do you reconcile mercy from people you were taught to fear? How do you accept kindness from an enemy you'd been trained to hate with absolute certainty? The truck bed had reeked of diesel fuel and fear during the journey. Only 3 women pressed against each other in the stifling heat, their shoulders touching as the vehicle swayed with each pothole and rut in the road. Their eyes struggled to adjust to the single stripe of daylight cutting through the wooden slats like a lifeline. Greta had kept her face pressed to the gap between boards, desperate for any air that didn't taste of sweat and terror. Outside, America unfolded like a film she couldn't pause or rewind, a landscape she'd been taught to despise but couldn't quite reconcile with the images before her eyes. Green, impossibly, endlessly green. Cornfields stretched across the horizon, their stalks standing tall and orderly, leaves catching the afternoon sun and throwing it back in waves of gold. A red barn perched on a distant hill, its paint still bright, its roof intact and whole. White sheets snapped on a clothesline behind a farmhouse, billowing in the wind like flags of surrender. Except no one here had surrendered. The war still raged across Europe. American boys were still dying, German boys too. A child on a porch waved as the truck rattled past. Just waved. As if military vehicles full of enemy prisoners were as ordinary as the milk delivery. As expected as the morning sun. Greta's breath caught. This can't be right. This can't possibly be right. The propaganda films had shown her an America in ruins, cities reduced to rubble, citizens standing in breadlines, gaunt and starving, a nation brought to its knees by righteous German might. Roosevelt, the warmonger, the savage Americans who showed no mercy to anyone, least of all captured women. She'd memorized those images, let them justify every transmission she'd sent from her radio post during the war. Every order she'd relayed without question or hesitation. 3 weeks ago, their communications base near Frankfurt had fallen to advancing American tanks. Greta had expected a bullet, perhaps something worse. The training films had been absolutely clear about what Americans did to capture German women, the horrors that awaited them. Instead, she'd been processed like a piece of paperwork, her name written carefully on a form in neat English script. Not branded, not erased, simply recorded. Greta Hoffmann, age 24, Luftwaffe Communications Auxiliary. They'd given her watery soup and a grey blanket that reeked of carbolic soap. No one had touched her except to check for concealed weapons. She'd been treated like a human being, and that had terrified her more than any brutality could have. Now this. Fields and barns and a waving child and the impossible smell of home baking. Beside her, Ilse Werner trembled like a caught bird trapped in someone's hands. The girl was only 19 but looked younger, worn down by experience no 19-year-old should endure. Her nurse's uniform was still stained with blood that wouldn't wash out, no matter how hard she scrubbed. She'd barely spoken since their capture, only humming fragments of lullabies under her breath when she thought no one was listening. Greta wanted to comfort her somehow, but didn't know how. What comfort existed in a world where everything you'd been taught might be a lie, where the enemy offers you soup and blankets instead of bullets? The truck slowed, turned through a gate. Wooden signs in English announced the destination. Greta's secret language, learned from her grandmother's old books hidden in the attic, allowed her to read the words. Fort d'Amoin, Women's POW Annex. The engine cut out. Orders shouted in English she half understood through exhaustion and fear. Out. Single file. Keep your hands visible. The woman's voice was firm but not cruel, accented in a way Greta couldn't place. Not quite American. They stumbled down from the truck bed on legs cramped and stiff from hours of sitting. Greta's first impression was how startlingly clean everything appeared. Wooden barracks painted white with cheerful blue trim. Gravel paths raked smooth and neat. A volleyball net strung between posts. A volleyball net, as if this were a summer camp instead of a prison. Laundry lines stood empty, waiting for washing day. Window boxes held bright red geraniums. Where were the guard towers? Where were the torture cells? Barbed wire existed around the perimeter, but seemed almost decorative, strung low and loose, more a boundary marker than a genuine barrier. Where were the dogs? The executions? Where was the savagery they'd been promised? Then the wind shifted again. The smell hit like a memory that didn't belong to her, a scent she shouldn't recognize but somehow did. Cinnamon and butter and baked apples filling the warm summer air. The scent of pie crust going golden in an oven, sweet and warm and impossibly domestic. Greta's grandmother had made apple cake every Sunday before the war, before the bombs, before everything changed. The kitchen would fill with that exact smell, and young Greta would press her nose to the oven door, watching sugar bubble and caramelize through the glass, turning amber and dark brown at the edges. Several women stopped mid-step. One whispered, her voice breaking, "Apfelkuchen," apple cake. An American woman in sergeant's stripes stood by the building marked Messe Hall. She wore an expression of careful neutrality, but her hands were covered in flour. Behind her, through an open door, Greta could see an industrial oven. 12 perfect pies cooled on metal racks, their latticework crusts golden and perfect. Their filling bubbling through in places where sugar had caramelized to dark amber. The sergeant caught Greta staring. For a moment their eyes met. Blue to blue, victor to vanquished, baker to the girl who'd forgotten what safety smelled like. The sergeant's jaw tightened. She looked away first, wiping her hands on her apron with sharp, angry movements. But the smell remained. Cinnamon, butter, impossibility. Greta's knees went weak. She'd prepared herself for brutality, for vindication of every terrible thing she'd been taught about the enemy. She could have survived hatred. She understood hatred. But this? A mess hall that smelled like her grandmother's kitchen. She had no defense against that at all. The days began to take shape slowly, like photographs developing in chemical baths. A bell rang at 6 each morning, clear and ordinary, not the harsh klaxon she'd expected. Breakfast in the mess hall meant oatmeal, sometimes powdered eggs, coffee that tasted of burnt chicory but was hot and plentiful. Work assignments were read from a clipboard by Sergeant Novak, a woman whose Polish accent surfaced when she was tired, softening her consonants in ways that made Greta's chest ache for reasons she couldn't name. Greta drew garden duty, an American vegetable garden behind the barracks already half-planted by prisoners who'd arrived before them. She knelt in the dirt that first morning, German hands in American earth, and didn't know whether to laugh or weep. Tomatoes staked in neat rows, bean poles waiting for climbing vines, lettuce and radishes pushing through dark Iowa soil. The woman working beside her, Margaret, a baker from Munich, whispered as she pulled weeds. "They pay us 80 cents a week in camp script. The Geneva Convention requires it." Greta's fingers stilled in the soil. Payment implied value. Payment implied you were still human. Payment implied a system of laws that applied even to enemies. Margaret continued, wonder and confusion equal in her voice. "There's a canteen. You can buy pencils, soap, thread, things." That Saturday, Greta received her first wages. 80 cents in paper script handed over by a bored corporal who checked her name off a list. She stared at the bills, turning them over in her hands. The weight of it seemed enormous. She bought a pencil and a small notebook from the canteen. That night, by the light of a single bulb strung between beds, she began to write. First, lists. What she'd been taught versus what she actually saw. Propaganda versus reality. The columns didn't match. They didn't even occupy the same universe. Then memories came pouring out. Her brother Hans, dead at Stalingrad. Greta had believed every lie about his sacrifice being noble and necessary. Her mother killed in the firebombing raids while Greta sat safe at her radio post. The Jewish family she'd watched SS officers drag from their apartment in broad daylight. The father's glasses broken on the pavement, the little girl's shoe left behind on the sidewalk. Greta had turned away. She'd told herself it wasn't her business, that they must have done something to deserve it. That good Germans didn't ask questions, that good Germans just obeyed. Good Germans. The phrase tasted like ash now. English classes met 3 afternoons a week in what had once been a recreation room. Sergeant Novak taught, writing phrases on a chalkboard in careful block letters. Good morning, please, thank you. Her German was functional but clumsy, and she never smiled when she spoke it, as if the language itself caused her actual pain. Greta already spoke English fluently, her grandmother's secret gift learned from books hidden in the attic. But she attended anyway, watching Novak's hands tremble when she erased the board, watching her jaw clench when certain words were pronounced. Watching her glance toward the kitchen where pies baked every Sunday, filling the compound with that impossible smell of safety and home. The pies were for the staff, never for prisoners. Novak made that clear without saying a word aloud, simply by carrying them into the guards' quarters and closing the door. But the smell drifted through the compound anyway. A weekly reminder that somewhere in this strange captivity, someone still cared about making things beautiful. Then Corporal Riley arrived, transferred from a facility out east. Young and bitter, with his brother's dog tags worn outside his uniform like a challenge. He didn't break the Geneva rules, impossible though it was for some men, but he moved through the compound radiating contempt. Crowds muttered under his breath, "Nazi bitches." When he thought no one important was listening, guard duty slowed when he was on watch. Recreation hour ended 10 minutes early. Rations were portioned smaller. The women learned to avoid him, to keep their eyes down when he passed. Ilse started shaking again. The fragile peace she'd built crumbled under his hostility. It was Margaret who finally made what he considered a mistake, turned too quickly during roll call and bumped his shoulder. "Watch it," he snapped, shoving her back hard enough that she stumbled and fell to her knees. Sergeant Novak's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Corporal Riley, my office. Now!" Greta was close enough to hear the conversation through thin office walls. Novak's voice low and shaking with something that might have been rage or grief or both. "These women follow the rules. You follow the rules. Geneva applies to everyone, or it applies to no one. Your brother would want us to be better than them." Silence. Then Riley's footsteps, heavy and angry, retreating down the corridor. Greta watched from the garden as Novak emerged minutes later, her hands trembling as she lit a cigarette. She stood there for a long moment, smoking and staring at nothing, fighting herself as hard as she'd fought for them. 3 months passed like water, finding its level. Summer bloomed across Iowa, turning the prison garden into something almost miraculous. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, splitting their skins with ripeness. Beans climbed their poles in green spirals. Lettuce went to seed, and Greta learned to harvest it before the heat made it bitter. The women ate what they grew, supplementing the mess hall rations with vegetables they'd coaxed from American soil with German hands. English classes advanced beyond simple phrases. Greta could hold conversations now, though she still pretended her skill was newly acquired. Ilse had stopped shaking quite so much, her hands steady enough to help in the infirmary. Even Margaret smiled sometimes, teaching the younger women folk songs during recreation hour, songs that sounded different here, stripped of their martial triumph, returned to their roots as simple human music. A Red Cross inspector came in late June, a Swiss woman with kind eyes and a clipboard thick with regulations. She interviewed prisoners privately, checking for coercion and abuse and starvation. Her report was read aloud by Lieutenant Colonel Rhodes during an assembly, using words like exemplary and model facility. Some women wept with relief. Others simply stared, still unable to reconcile mercy with everything they'd been taught about enemies. The 4th of July arrived hot and bright. The American staff prepared a picnic on the lawn between the barracks and the administrative building. Red checkered tablecloths spread across tables, cold lemonade in glass pitchers, a radio playing big band music that drifted through the compound like a dream. Sergeant Novak had been baking since dawn. 12 apple pies cooled on racks in the mess hall kitchen, their golden crusts absolutely perfect. Their filling bubbling through in places where sugar had caramelized to deep amber. The smell was torture. That same cinnamon butter heaven that had broken something in Greta on her first day. That reminder of everything lost. She knelt in the garden, pretending to check the tomatoes for hornworms, but really just breathing in that impossible scent and trying not to cry. My Oma made apple cake every Sunday before the war. She said quietly to Ilsa, who was weeding nearby, "This smells exactly the same. How can enemies smell the same?" Ilsa had no answer, but her hand found Greta's and squeezed. Footsteps on gravel. Greta looked up to find Sergeant Novak standing at the garden gate, still wearing her flour-dusted apron, her face unreadable in the summer glare. A long beat of silence then. "Wait here." She disappeared into the mess hall. She returned carrying 2 plates, 2 forks, 2 slices of pie still warm from the oven. She set them on the garden bench with careful precision, as if afraid that any sudden movement might break whatever fragile thing was happening. "Happy Independence Day," Novak said in slow, careful German, her accent terrible but her meaning absolutely clear. "Today we remember why we fight. Not for hate, for the idea that all people deserve dignity." Greta stared at the pie. Golden crust, cinnamon dark filling. A small act that felt enormous, impossible, dangerous. Her throat closed around words she couldn't find in any language. Ilsa whispered softly, "Danke." "Thank you." In hesitant English, she managed the words. "Thank you." Novak gave a single, crisp nod, the kind a soldier gives when duty calls. She turned away quickly, but not before Greta caught sight of her brushing at her eyes with the back of her hand. The sergeant moved back toward the picnic area with her spine held rigid, as though carrying an invisible burden that weighed only on her shoulders. The pie remained warm to the touch, its pastry shattering delicately when fork met crust. The apples had softened into tenderness, sweetened with sugar, brightened by the sharp bite of lemon, seasoned with cinnamon and nutmeg. Spices Greta couldn't quite place, but recognized in her bones. It tasted like stepping into her grandmother's kitchen on a Sunday morning, back when the world still made sense, back before everything changed, like being truly seen by someone who had every reason to turn away. Ilsa ate with deliberate slowness, tears streaming down her face unchecked, making no move to wipe them away. When her plate was empty, she set down her fork carefully. "God," she whispered, "I'd forgotten food could feel like this, like kindness itself." That same evening, fresh prisoners arrived. New arrivals from the collapsing German state, transported across the ocean to this prairie camp, where gardens flourished and volleyball nets stood waiting, and the scent of baked goods drifted through the compound like something from another lifetime. They carried stories that turned Greta's insides to ice. Germany destroyed, cities reduced to rubble, casualties beyond counting, and the camps they described weren't like this place at all. These were different, systematic, industrial, designed for death. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Auschwitz. Names that meant nothing until the new women spoke them. Their voices stripped raw by what they'd witnessed. Gas chambers, crematoriums, numbers so astronomical they ceased to have meaning. Greta sat on her bunk that night, the flavor of apples still coating her tongue, and tried to make sense of figures that defied comprehension. 6 million. How does a person's mind even hold such a number? Her notebook lay open before her, but her pencil remained still. No words existed for this. She tried the familiar defense. We didn't know. But even as the thought formed, it felt hollow. They had known something. Everyone had known something. They'd simply chosen not to see, not to question, not to care, because caring meant acting, and acting meant danger. A woman named Hilda appeared in the center of the barracks, her eyes blazing, her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles went white. She spat her fury at anyone who would listen. Allied propaganda, she insisted. They destroyed our cities, murdered our children, then spread lies about camps that never existed. Some women nodded in agreement, others looked away. Greta understood then, with sickening clarity, that the true war hadn't ended. The struggle for truth was only just beginning. Official word came through on May 8th. Hitler dead, Germany defeated. The fighting was over. Lieutenant Colonel Rhodes delivered the announcement during morning assembly, her voice steady and almost conversational, and for a moment the entire group remained frozen. Then someone in the back began weeping, not from joy or sorrow, but from simple, exhausted confusion. What did victory mean for the defeated? Parcels started arriving in waves after that. Red Cross packages, forwarded through channels that had finally reopened. Greta's came on a Tuesday. The envelope was thin and worn from travel, bearing a postmark from a displaced persons camp in the British zone. She recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to her mother's friend from their apartment building. Her hands trembled as she read the words. Her mother had died in February during the bombing of Dresden. Her father was missing, almost certainly killed on the Eastern Front. Their apartment building was reduced to rubble and ash. "You have no home to return to," the letter said in careful script. "I thought you should know before you tried to go back. There's nothing left, child, only ghosts and ruins." Greta folded the letter with mechanical precision, tucked it into her pocket, and walked out to the garden where tomatoes hung heavy and red, and beans climbed toward the vast Iowa sky, where American soil had taken German seeds and nurtured them regardless. She knelt between the rows and didn't allow herself to cry. Crying would mean there was still something soft inside her capable of breaking. Elsa received no such letter. For 3 days, she sat on her bunk, staring at nothing, and Greta understood she was mourning the absence of everyone she'd ever known. Because silence meant they were gone. All of them. Everyone. The entire world someone had built for herself collapsed. Not everyone grieved. Some women found quiet joy in survival, relieved that the killing had ended, grateful they'd made it through, unwilling to mourn a system that had used them so thoroughly and then discarded them without hesitation. Others became consumed by rage. Hilda gathered women around her like a gathering storm, her voice turned sharp and certain in the darkness after lights were extinguished. "They're constructing us as villains," she hissed, "readying us for show trials, forcing us to confess to atrocities we never committed. Those supposed camps. Allied propaganda to justify what they unleashed on our cities. My sons died defending Germany. Now they want us to believe it was meaningless." Greta had stayed silent through 3 nights of this rhetoric. But on the 4th night, when Hilda's voice rose higher, insisting the death camps were merely propaganda and invention, something inside Greta split open. She stood. The single bulb overhead cast her shadow long across the barracks floor. "I witnessed the SS execute a Jewish family in Dresden. I watched them pull the parents into the street and shoot them. Their daughter was perhaps 5. She lost a shoe as she ran. I remember thinking someone should retrieve it for her. The silence that followed was absolute. I did nothing," Greta continued, her voice hollow and steady. "I convinced myself it wasn't my concern, that they must have deserved it, that real Germans don't ask questions. I accepted the lies because accepting them was simpler than resisting." She withdrew her notebook from beneath her pillow. Months of careful observations, questions, recorded truths. "Look around. We have bunks, food, wages, medical care. They treat us according to rules even after we've violated every code. That isn't propaganda, that's the truth." She met Hilda's eyes across the dimness. "The real question isn't whether the camps existed. It's why we permitted ourselves to serve monsters." "And what comes next?" Hilda's face went white, then crimson. She rose, shaking with fury or devastation or both. "You're a traitor, a coward hiding behind accusations against your own people." "I'm a coward who's finished being one," Greta said quietly. I can't resurrect those I failed to save. But I can stop betraying the truth. Hilda stormed from the barracks. Several followed her into the night. The rest remained, watching Greta with expressions she couldn't interpret. Some showed anger, others seemed relieved. A few appeared to recognize themselves in her words. Margaret gave a small nod. Solidarity without words. Elsa reached over and took Greta's hand, gripping it tightly. In her office, Sergeant Novak sat surrounded by photographs, documentation from the liberated camps, images that no human should ever witness, images she couldn't stop looking at. Her cousins in Warsaw, her mother's extended family, almost certainly all gone, destroyed in those ovens. Novak baked her pies and followed regulations and tried to be something better than her rage would allow. That morning, she'd nearly walked away. She'd written her resignation letter. Lieutenant Colonel Rhodes had read it without any visible reaction. Then she'd spoken quietly. If we become like them, they've already won. We do this not for them, but for ourselves, to demonstrate that law and humanity can endure even this. Novak had torn the letter to pieces. She returned to the kitchen. But that Sunday, for the first time since the camp's opening, she didn't bake. The kitchen remained dark and cold. The compound smelled only of summer heat and growing vegetation. And somehow this absence felt more honest than any pie ever could. Repatriation began when August arrived. Women were called in alphabetical order, handed train documents and travel papers, sent back to a Germany that now existed only as fragments. Many went eagerly, desperate to discover what remained of home. Others departed with dread, knowing they were returning to destruction and foreign occupation and the weight of collective guilt. Greta volunteered for the final transport. She wasn't ready to confront Dresden's ghosts, the loss of her mother, the silence where her father's voice should be. She remained, watching each woman depart, watching beds become empty one by one. She tended the garden as it produced its last harvest, tomatoes and beans and squash that wouldn't survive until winter. September brought a strange quiet to the compound. People continued their routines, but the vitality had vanished. A peculiar stillness replaced the energy that had existed before. Greta worked mostly alone in the garden on most afternoons, preparing soil for winter, removing exhausted plants. She selected seeds carefully and placed them in envelopes, labeling each one in her precise handwriting. Sergeant Novak found her there on an afternoon when the temperature had dropped and light fell gold and long through the dried corn beyond the fence. She brought 2 cups of coffee and a folded piece of paper. She set them on the garden bench without requesting permission. For a time, they simply occupied the same space, drinking weak coffee and watching the shadows grow longer. "Why do you bake?" "Greta had asked you that once," Novak said finally. Her English was clear, but exhaustion weighted her accent heavily. Greta nodded, her voice uncertain. "My mother baked when she was afraid, when work was scarce for my father, when we might lose our home, when Poland's future was uncertain. She believed we can't govern the world, but we can decide whether it contains something sweet." Novak's grip tightened on her cup. "I thought it was fragile. Now I recognize it as the most powerful lesson she ever gave me." She extended the folded paper. Greta accepted it with shaking fingers. She opened it to discover a recipe in careful handwriting. Apple pie, exact measurements and detailed instructions, and a brief note at the bottom. "Use tart apples if available," it said. "Add extra cinnamon when using sweeter varieties." "My mother's recipe," Novak said. "You'll need it more than I will." Greta stared at the paper, her vision blurred by tears. "I don't merit this. None of us do. We don't deserve mercy." Novak's voice came out rough and strained. "Precisely what makes it mercy," she replied. She stood and walked away before Greta could form a response. Her shoulders bore that same invisible weight they'd carried since that initial day. The weight of choosing law instead of vengeance. Of becoming better when surrender to cruelty would have been so much simpler. The next morning, all remaining prisoners were gathered in the mess hall. Mandatory screening, orders from Allied command. The projector began its mechanical chatter and newsreel footage filled the screen, the camps as they were discovered. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, Bodies arranged like cordwood. Survivors so emaciated they barely seemed alive. Gas chambers, cremation pits, the mechanized apparatus of systematic murder exposed in black and white images. Some women sobbed uncontrollably. Others stared with vacant expressions. Hilda finally shattered. She vomited into a trash bin, whispering the same words repeatedly like a prayer or an indictment. I knew. I knew. The footage continued for 20 minutes that stretched like 20 hours. When illumination returned, nobody moved. Greta rose to her feet. Her legs felt unsteady, but she stood regardless. She held Novak's recipe in one hand and her notebook in the other. We were manipulated. We were deceived. But we also elected to believe the lies because doubt would have required courage. Her voice remained steady, which surprised even her. We cannot undo what transpired. However, we can choose what principles guide us from here. She raised the recipe card. I'm keeping this. A gesture of compassion from someone with every justification to despise me. A reminder that not all responded to cruelty with more cruelty. She surveyed the room, faces she'd lived beside for months. Ilsa's wounded eyes, Margaret's determined expression, even Hilda's fractured anguish. When I return to what remains of my home, I intend to build a garden. I will bake. I will speak truth, no matter the difficulty. She paused, particularly when honesty cost something. No applause followed. This wasn't an occasion for celebration. But Ilsa rose beside her, then Margaret, then others, gradually standing, women choosing to carry truth forward rather than let it be buried beneath the wreckage of their losses. Sergeant Novak remained at the room's perimeter, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. But when Greta found her eyes, Novak nodded once, a small acknowledgement. We endured this together. This matters. 3 days later, Greta boarded the eastbound train with Novak's recipe secured in her pocket and tomato seeds from the Iowa garden wrapped carefully in newspaper. She was traveling back to a nation that had ceased to exist, to a home that was only ash, to confront truths that would remain forever unbearable. Yet she carried apple pie and garden seeds, the certainty that mercy persists, the knowledge that those designated enemies could choose humanity. It wasn't sufficient, but it was enough to begin.